In towns like Rock Hill, South Carolina, murder wasn't a word people used in the present tense. It was reserved for cold headlines or distant stories from bigger cities, not the quiet grid of one-story homes where driveways stayed swept and morning routines were uninterrupted by sirens. But that winter morning, Tuesday, January 23rd, something broke that order, and it began with a missed appointment. Melinda Snyder, 22, was supposed to be at school before 7:30. Her car was still in the driveway. Her porch light was off. She hadn't answered the phone since the night before. The 911 call came in from a colleague at the elementary school where Melinda had just begun work as a teaching assistant. It wasn't dramatic, just a concern. "She's never late. We're worried," the caller said. Officers responded to the rental property on Finley Road at 6:58 a.m., arriving to find no obvious sign of trouble. The front door was locked. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows. The house was quiet, too quiet. When patrol knocked and got no answer, they walked the perimeter. No dog, no lights. The mailbox hadn't been emptied. But Melinda's 1988 Mazda was parked neatly in front, frosted windshield undisturbed, suggesting it hadn't been moved since the night prior. Given the lack of any movement in her known reliability, they called in authorization to enter the home. What they found changed the scope of the morning entirely. Melinda was in her bedroom. She was lying on her back. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was exposed to the ceiling, her expression still. There was no visible struggle in the room. No overturned furniture. No broken glass. The sheets were pulled just below her chin. But the blood soaking into the pillow under her neck revealed what the dim lighting hadn't. She was dead, and had been for hours. No weapon was visible in the room. There were no bloody footprints, no scattered belongings. Officers didn't find any signs of a break-in. The front door was locked from the outside, and nothing inside appeared stolen. Her purse was still by the table, her wallet untouched. Jewelry on her dresser remained where she had left it. The television remote sat precisely aligned on the coffee table. The temperature in the room suggested the house's heating had cycled normally throughout the night. The back door was locked. The only abnormality was a cold draft coming from the small front window, slightly ajar, but not enough to be a point of entry. What drew attention was a single detail hanging outside the main door, a realtor's lockbox, still mounted to the handle. According to procedure, it should have been removed after the lease agreement was finalized. But there it was, closed, undisturbed, and potentially containing a key. Investigators from the York County Sheriff's Office arrived at 7:34 a.m. The body was declared at the scene by paramedics at 7:39 a.m. Time of death was tentatively estimated at approximately 3:30 to 5 a.m., based on body temperature and early lividity. Melinda Snyder had lived in the house for just over 3 weeks. A recent graduate from Winthrop University, she had moved in after accepting a teaching assistant position at a nearby elementary school. Her background check was clean. She had no reported enemies, no abusive relationships, no financial issues. She attended church regularly, taught Sunday school, and had a close network of friends. She wasn't involved in drugs, no mental health history, no known romantic entanglements. The first search of the premises revealed no messages, no notes, no signs of digital activity overnight. Her answering machine showed no new calls. Her personal calendar listed nothing past Monday evening. A search warrant was quickly secured to examine her room and electronics. Forensic technicians photographed the entire property, focusing particularly on entry points and the lockbox on the front door. The lockbox was removed and cataloged. Inside it, a single key to the front door. No signs of tampering, no forced override. The code had been input normally, meaning someone knew the combination. There were no surveillance cameras on the property. The neighbors hadn't heard or seen anything suspicious. One neighbor mentioned hearing a car engine around 4:01 a.m., but said it wasn't unusual. People work night shifts around here. No visual confirmation of the vehicle. No description. Just a sound in the dark. The coroner's early report confirmed what the scene had already suggested. Cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the right side of the neck at close range. There were also signs of sexual assault. A rape kit was performed. Tissue and fluid samples were collected and expedited to SLED's crime lab in Columbia for DNA analysis. Results were expected within several weeks. At this point, the working theory was limited. There were no obvious motives, no forced entry, no robbery, nothing was disturbed. The crime scene was disturbingly controlled, precise, as if the killer had known exactly where to go and how to leave. Melinda's parents were notified mid-morning. They had last spoken to her the previous night around 9:01 p.m. According to their statement, everything had seemed fine. She was excited about her new job and planning to attend a church function later that week. That day, Rock Hill didn't just lose a young teacher. It lost a sense of safety. The kind of crime that shakes communities wasn't just on the news anymore, it was on Finley Road. The data didn't conflict, and that's what made it unsettling. Sometimes the neatest scenes are the ones we should fear most. Melinda Snyder's file wasn't supposed to end like this. At the York County Sheriff's Department, she was just case Ron 1919-123A until they added a name. And once they did, it became clear. This wasn't someone who had quietly slipped through society's cracks. She had been in the center of her own orbit, visible, respected, and deeply connected to her community. Born in 1967, Melinda had grown up in nearby Clover, South Carolina. Her background was stable. She was an only child in a middle-class family. Her parents, Warren and Sharon Snyder, had worked regular jobs. He in insurance, she in a local clinic. Melinda wasn't known for drama. She'd been an honors student, then a scholarship recipient at Winthrop University, where she graduated with a degree in elementary education just 6 months prior. In January 1990, she was living alone for the first time. Her new position as a teaching assistant at Finley Elementary gave her enough income to rent a small house. Modest, clean, and located just 10 minutes from the school. She signed the lease through a local real estate agent. She moved in 3 weeks before her death. Investigators noted she kept records. Her planner was current. Bank statements were balanced. Her grocery receipts, notes from parent-teacher meetings, and lesson plan drafts were all dated and in order. Nothing in the home appeared rushed, interrupted, or secretive. But during the initial review of her personal items, one folder stood out. A manila envelope labeled simply, January Notes. Inside were 3 handwritten pages. They weren't formal complaints, but they weren't meaningless either. Page 1 mentioned a noise she had heard outside the house late one night. Page 2 referenced an unmarked car seen parked across the street for 2 consecutive mornings. Page 3, dated January 18th, read, "Still feeling watched. Don't want to seem paranoid, but this doesn't feel right." It wasn't enough to form a police report, but it suggested Melinda had started noticing things, and perhaps someone. Detectives cross-referenced neighbors' statements. 2 residents on the street remembered seeing Melinda walking alone in the mornings. One recalled her standing near her mailbox, looking unsure, a few days prior to the incident. But none reported disturbances. No one mentioned hearing screams. Forensics returned a partial analysis of the scene. Soil residue near the front door didn't match the dirt around the house. Instead, it was consistent with a different location, likely a parking lot or construction site. Shoe impressions near the rear of the house weren't deep enough to cast, but lab results confirmed the tread pattern was male athletic size 11 or 12. That detail alone didn't narrow the field, but it ruled out Melinda's own footwear. Technicians also discovered something unusual in the kitchen drawer. Tucked beneath silverware was a business card, white, unbent, and clean. It belonged to a local real estate agent, the same one who had handled the leasing of the property. The name had not come up yet in the investigation, but the card was not placed casually. It had been set flat and precisely beneath a divider. It wasn't visible unless the entire tray was removed. The question investigators quietly asked among themselves, why hide something so specific? And only that. Theories began to build. If Melinda had been feeling uneasy, was she trying to gather her own evidence? Or was this just a coincidence? Her bank activity from the prior weekend showed a single withdrawal, $20 from a local ATM. No unusual transactions. Her phone records reflected 4 short calls to friends, all made before 9 p.m. Monday night. No outgoing calls after that. The last call she answered was at 8:47 p.m. from her mother. The timeline was tight. Nothing between then and the discovery of her body the next morning had left a clear trace. Whatever happened to Melinda occurred within that silent gap, somewhere between routine and disaster. By the end of the day, one thing was evident. This was not a random act. It was targeted, controlled, intentional. Sometimes the absence of chaos is its own kind of message. What doesn't get broken can speak louder than what does. There are few objects more innocuous than a real estate lockbox. Designed for convenience, it's meant to facilitate access, not raise suspicion. But in the case of Melinda Snyder, that small gray box on her front doorknob became the most immediate source of procedural failure investigators had seen in months. At the time of her murder, Melinda's rental property still had the original lockbox issued by the listing agent. It had not been removed after she moved in, and more importantly, it still functioned. The code had not been changed. That meant anyone with prior knowledge of the original four-digit entry, anyone with past access, could have used it to open the front door. Detectives examined the lockbox within hours of the scene being secured. It showed no signs of tampering or forced entry. The latch was unbroken. No scratches, no damage to the tumbler, no foreign residue. It had been opened recently, cleanly, without disturbance. Whoever used it knew exactly how to operate it, and more critically, when. Chain of access was the next step. Detectives pulled the property management file. The rental had been listed through a local agency in December 1989. According to internal logs, 5 agents had shown the house to prospective tenants. One of them, an independent agent under temporary contract, had both listed and handled the leasing paperwork. His name was noted clearly, Edward L. Cornell. The firm's front office confirmed that the lockbox code was standard across all properties at the time. That alone was a procedural red flag. Though not illegal under South Carolina code, it left multiple doors effectively unsecured post-lease. Records further revealed that while the property had been removed from public listing in early January, no internal request had been submitted to remove the physical box. Investigators contacted the property's owner, who had relied entirely on the listing agent to handle leasing. She had assumed the box had been taken down after Melinda moved in. She had not checked. She'd never met Melinda personally. Crime scene specialists returned to the house to examine the door itself. The lock showed no recent abrasions, no forced pressure. The deadbolt mechanism was intact. Lubricant traces on the keyway indicated recent, normal use. There were no splinters, scratches, or signs of a screwdriver or lockpick. This wasn't a break-in. It was authorized access, technically speaking. That distinction shifted the direction of the investigation. Instead of focusing on an unknown intruder who might have forced their way in, detectives now prioritized individuals who had legitimate or residual access to the property. A forensic technician from Saled ran trace swabs along the lockbox casing and key. Partial prints were found, though none clear enough for immediate ID. Still, 2 of the prints lifted bore similar ridge patterns. One matched Melinda, the other was unidentified, but consistent with a male. Detectives conducted interviews with the remaining agents who had shown the house. None recalled revisiting the property after the lease had been signed. None claimed to have re-accessed the box. Cornell, when contacted for questioning, stated that he never returned to the house after the final walkthrough with the tenant. His statement was logged, time-stamped, and submitted for verification. Still, the sequencing raised a concern. If Melinda had been dead for hours before being discovered, and there were no signs of entry, then the key, pulled from the lockbox, had been used during a very narrow window. Between roughly 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., the crime was precise, quiet, fast. The next procedural step was reconstructing the digital and physical access timeline. But there was a problem. No camera pointed at the front door, no doorbell camera. No neighbors had an angle on her porch. The streetlights worked, but the area wasn't well lit. It was a blind spot, both legally and physically. Detectives expanded the inquiry to include background on the lockbox manufacturer. They needed to know if usage logs were stored internally or if the model supported audit tracking. It didn't. The system was mechanical, not digital. No data, no timestamps, just an open and closed mechanism, the same kind that was installed on hundreds of homes across York County. But they weren't entirely blind. A traffic cam less than a block away captured a white vehicle driving slowly down the street at 3:52 a.m. The model and make were unclear, blurry at best, but the shape and silhouette suggested a 4-door compact sedan, early to mid-1980s, possibly a Mazda or Pontiac. The same general type Melinda herself drove. That detail wouldn't be useful on its own, but combined with forensic evidence recovered later that week, it would form the basis of a new timeline, one that shifted focus away from theories of random violence and towards something far more structured. Targeted access by someone who had every reason to believe no one would question how they got inside. There were still too many unanswered questions. Why had the box not been removed? Why had Melinda not demanded it be taken down? Did she know the code had remained unchanged? Or worse, had someone promised to handle it and simply never did? Security is often assumed, but in this case, assumed access was the very thing that cost her life. By the end of the first week, the investigation into Melinda Snyder's death narrowed to a name that had been sitting quietly in the background: Edward L. Cronell. He wasn't family, he wasn't a co-worker, and yet his name had appeared in official leasing paperwork, on a business card hidden in her drawer, and in internal logs at the real estate office responsible for her rental. His access wasn't speculative, it was documented. Detectives reviewed Cronell's original interaction with the property. According to leasing records, he had shown the house to at least 3 potential renters, Melinda among them. He also completed the walkthrough inspection and handled her final paperwork. The key and lockbox used during the showing were still present weeks later. That alone placed him in the narrow category of individuals who both knew the code and had unrestricted access at one point. On January 27th, 4 days after Melinda's body was found, investigators brought Cronell in for a formal interview. He arrived voluntarily, no attorney, no hesitation. He was clean-shaven, wore a tucked-in shirt, and spoke with confidence. His demeanor was casual, almost too casual for someone connected to an active homicide case. He stated he hadn't spoken to or seen Melinda after the lease was signed. He described her as polite, professional, and claimed no familiarity beyond the property showing. When asked about the lockbox, he claimed he'd assumed it had been removed after the lease was finalized. He denied revisiting the home at any point afterward. He couldn't recall the lockbox code offhand, but admitted the office had used the same combination across multiple properties. His alibi for the night of January 22nd into the morning of January 23rd was vague. He said he had stayed at his apartment and watched TV. When asked to clarify the timeline, specific shows, calls, or other activity, he gave general time estimates but no verifiable evidence. There were no receipts, no logged phone calls, and no witness to place him at home during the critical window. Detectives took notes on his posture. On paper, his answers were non-incriminating, but the gaps in his recall raised procedural flags. It wasn't just what he said, it was the absence of anything useful to corroborate it. The kind of uncertainty that makes an alibi impossible to confirm or deny. That same day, officers revisited the forensics team to check for any potential matches between fingerprints pulled from the lockbox and Cronell's record. His prints weren't in any criminal database, but since he had handled leasing paperwork, the team now had a legal basis to collect his prints directly. He complied. 3 partial ridge prints from the lockbox were re-examined. One print, partial but legible, matched Cronell's right index fingerprint. This print had been located along the inner hinge lip of the box. Forensic analysts clarified that it didn't confirm the time it had been left, but it did confirm that Cronell had accessed or touched the box at some point. That technicality didn't point to murder. It did, however, contradict his statement that he hadn't interacted with the box after Melinda moved in. At this stage, detectives documented the timeline conflict without confrontation. Instead, they focused on reconstructing Cronell's movements using secondary methods: vehicle registration history, gas station purchases, and local business CCTV logs. His car, a white 1984 Mazda sedan, was registered to his name. That detail stood out immediately. It was the same body type and color as the blurry image captured on the traffic camera near Melinda's Street at 3:52 a.m., the morning of the murder. The image wasn't definitive. There was no readable plate, but the match in silhouette, make, and year tightened the circle. No surveillance footage directly tied his vehicle to her house. No forensic evidence yet placed him inside the home that night. But his print on the lockbox, the vehicle match, and the missing removal order for the key box together began building a case. Not one of direct guilt, but of questionable behavior, opportunity, and a failure to disclose fully. Investigators began pulling prior complaints filed with the real estate office. No formal police reports, but 3 entries in their internal complaint log referenced inappropriate comments or uncomfortable behavior made by Cronell during prior showings. None were violent. None involved Melinda, but they demonstrated a pattern that had gone undocumented outside the office walls. In criminal investigations, patterns matter. So do lies of omission. And when a man under scrutiny for murder says he hadn't touched a lockbox, but his print says otherwise, that contradiction becomes a wedge investigators use to keep pressing. Melinda's death hadn't been a random act. That much was now clear. It required access, timing, and a degree of planning. And Ed Cronell, whether guilty or not, sat in the unique position of being the only person outside of Melinda herself who had unquestioned access to the front door, and no solid alibi to protect him. Motive can be complex, but access, timing, and deception, those build a foundation, and foundations don't lie. By the start of February, the case had stalled publicly. No arrests, no press conferences. But behind the scenes, the crime lab was working. Samples collected from Melinda Snyder's body had been rushed to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SLAD, for DNA testing within 24 hours of the crime scene being secured. And now, 11 days later, the first conclusive result came back. Semen was present. It had been collected from both internal and external swabs during autopsy. The sample produced a full DNA profile. It did not match anyone in CODIS, the National DNA Database. That wasn't unusual. Many first-time offenders don't exist in the system, but it gave investigators a new route: direct comparison against voluntarily collected prints and samples. A request had already been submitted for Ed Cronell's DNA. He complied without objection during the same appointment when his fingerprints were taken. His buccal swab had been processed under chain of custody protocols, sealed and delivered to the same lab. The match was exact. The DNA from the crime scene and the sample collected from Cronell were indistinguishable. Probability of error: less than 1 in 900 billion. Technically, there was no room for doubt. The lab didn't provide interpretation. It provided identity. What remained was explanation, and that's where things got harder. Investigators immediately returned to Cronell's prior statement. He had said he hadn't seen Melinda after the lease was finalized. He said he hadn't entered the house again. He hadn't implied any relationship, professional or otherwise. The DNA now proved physical contact, not just presence, but an act. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't circumstantial. This was biological evidence linking the victim and the person who denied ever being near her post-lease. But DNA, while definitive in placing someone at a scene, does not clarify consent, timing, or intent. Prosecutors know that, investigators know that, and at trial, defense teams always exploit that limitation. So the next step wasn't prosecution, it was reconstruction, proving the timeline of contact and narrowing the window of when it occurred. The autopsy timeline supported the lab results. The sexual contact occurred close to the estimated time of death, no more than a few hours before. Melinda's body showed no signs of consensual activity. There were small tears in tissue, bruising on the inner thighs, and ligature compression on the neck. She had been sexually assaulted, then killed. That sequence held up medically, but the legal burden required more. That's where digital forensics came in. Detectives pulled cell tower records near Melinda's home. Cronell's cell phone had not made any calls between 11 p.m. and 5 p.m. the night of the murder, but passive ping records, silent location data from his phone communicating with local towers, placed him within a 1-mile radius of Melinda's house at 3:48 a.m. and again at 4:12 a.m. 2 separate pings, same device, within walking distance of the house. The phone was not at his apartment, where he claimed to have stayed the entire night. This contradicted his alibi. Combined with the DNA match and fingerprint on the lockbox, the forensic trail was now layered. Biology, digital presence, access history, all pointed in the same direction. Still, the department didn't move immediately on an arrest. They wanted to avoid any procedural missteps. The case was building cleanly, and each piece strengthened the next. The mistake would be to rush now. Instead, they focused on one final area: behavior analysis. Cronell's previous tenants were contacted. 2 agreed to speak. 1 recalled him being a little too friendly during walkthroughs. Another said he came by once or twice after lease signing under the pretext of checking plumbing. Neither had filed official complaints, but the pattern aligned with what the office records had already suggested, a habit of overstepping boundaries without drawing legal lines. Melinda's notes, recovered from the manila envelope in Chapter 2, now held more weight. Still feeling watched. Unmarked car. Doesn't feel right. At the time, those were viewed as general unease. Now they fit a pattern of pre-crime awareness, early signs that something wasn't just off, but escalating. Some stories don't end in confrontation. They end in documentation. Melinda had started documenting. She didn't know it would become evidence. She was simply responding to a feeling most victims can't articulate until it's too late. Science gave the case direction, but her instinct gave it context. And sometimes that's the detail that matters most. Access wasn't improvised in this case. It was calculated. Investigators had already confirmed the front door showed no signs of forced entry, no broken lock, no splintered frame, no compromised deadbolt. The entry wasn't opportunistic. It was intentional and precise. The presence of the realtor lockbox still affixed to the door provided the clearest vector. Standard mechanical model, 4-digit code, no logging system. Ed Cronel had used it during the leasing process, and although he'd claimed he hadn't returned to the property, his fingerprint on the internal hinge, combined with the untouched condition of the lockbox, undermined that claim. What detectives needed now was confirmation that the box had been used the night of the murder. Without a digital audit trail, they had to reverse engineer the timeline through physical sequencing. The key inside the lockbox had been used, no doubt. The lab's latent print team found smudges consistent with recent contact on the key's shaft and bowl. No distinct fingerprint remained due to oil transfer, but the lack of dust and the presence of modern skin oils, analyzed under UV, supported recent handling. It hadn't sat untouched for weeks. They also examined the strike plate on the doorframe. There was no new scoring or misalignment, ruling out forceful contact. A very faint grease transfer pattern, consistent with a bare hand bracing the frame during key insertion, was lifted using magnetic powder. It aligned with a right-handed person opening the door while pushing inward. The positioning correlated with typical adult male height and stance. These details didn't provide identity, but they confirmed access and method. From the moment Melinda entered that home, the failure to remove that box had left her vulnerable. It's a common oversight in property transitions, one too often dismissed as harmless. But in this case, it was the critical security flaw that made the rest of the crime possible. Investigators reconstructed the path of entry. The killer approached from the street under minimal lighting. The neighbor's porch light was off. No vehicle parked directly in front of Melinda's driveway that night, as per her neighbor's early morning recollection. The killer likely parked 1 or 2 houses down, approaching on foot. He accessed the lockbox, retrieved the key, entered the home, and closed the door behind him. No damage, no disruption. The home was quiet. Melinda was likely asleep. The ambient temperature in the room and undisturbed furniture supported that theory. There were no signs of struggle in the main hallway or kitchen. The bedroom was the primary scene. Crime scene investigators confirmed impressions on the carpet, 2 distinct weight imprints, consistent with a person standing near the foot of the bed for an extended time. There were no shoe prints, only pressure shifts. A single set of fibers, blue polyester cotton blend, was collected from the foot of the mattress. These did not match any known clothing recovered from Melinda's closet. They were consistent with men's work pants. Sequence of events, entry without force, quiet movement through the house, approach while the victim was asleep. Initial contact involved restraint, then assault, then fatal injury. The gunshot was fired from a distance of approximately 2 feet, according to the coroner's ballistic residue analysis. A .22 caliber entry wound on the right side of the neck, angled slightly downward. Clean trajectory, no exit wound. The bullet was recovered from the pillow beneath her. It was registered as untraceable. No rifling marks matched any weapon on file. That detail would slow down the prosecution, but not the momentum of the investigation. The key was returned to the box. That was deliberate. It suggested post-crime control. He left through the same door, locking it behind him. This behavior wasn't impulsive, it was procedural. In the days after this reconstruction, investigators conducted a quiet interview with building management. They confirmed that lockboxes were routinely left on properties for up to 60 days post-lease, unless specifically removed by the agent. No such order had been made for Melinda's address. That omission was not just procedural, it was fatal. Cases like this expose vulnerabilities that exist in system loopholes. Access control isn't just a logistical issue. It's a matter of life and death when accountability lapses. It's also the kind of detail that gets overlooked until it's already too late. He didn't break in. He just walked in. That's what made this so dangerous. The arrest came quietly. No chase, no resistance. On March 8, 1990, Ed Cronell was taken into custody at his residence, following a sealed indictment by a York County grand jury. He was charged with first-degree murder, criminal sexual conduct, and first-degree burglary. The evidence submitted for the indictment was precise. DNA, fingerprint correlation, cell tower triangulation, and digital inconsistencies in his alibi. Together, it formed a prosecutorial outline strong enough to move the case to trial without hesitation. The pretrial hearings were procedural. No plea deals were offered. Cronell's legal team filed a motion to suppress the DNA evidence, citing improper consent. That motion was denied. He had voluntarily submitted the sample without counsel present. But under South Carolina law at the time, consent didn't require advisement if not under arrest. The judge ruled the collection lawful. Jury selection began in September 1990. The trial opened in early October, and for the first time, the public heard the full forensic narrative laid out in sequence. The prosecution didn't rely on storytelling. They relied on data, on the convergence of physical, biological, and digital proof. The lead forensic analyst testified to the DNA match with a calculated tone. She explained how the buccal swab from Cronell matched the semen recovered during the post-mortem examination. She clarified the statistical certainty. The courtroom was silent. The defense didn't challenge the match directly. Instead, they leaned on interpretation. Their argument was that the DNA only proved sexual contact, not murder. They implied a consensual relationship that had gone undocumented, but they failed to explain why Cronell had lied about ever seeing Melinda after the lease was signed. They couldn't explain why he'd been near her house in the early hours of the morning. They offered no reason for the unreported access through a realtor lockbox or the recovered .22 caliber shell casing found lodged under the baseboard heater, a small metallic clue recovered by technicians on their third sweep of the bedroom. Melinda's parents sat through the testimony. They hadn't spoken publicly, but they watched as her final hours were dissected in detail. Her name wasn't just on court documents anymore. It was on every screen, every printed report, every photograph presented into evidence. And in each exhibit, the prosecution emphasized a detail that had remained consistent: controlled access, silent entry, and a sequence of violence timed too tightly to mistake. The defense brought forward one witness, a former client who had rented a property through Cronell a year earlier. She described him as respectful, helpful, and never inappropriate. The prosecution countered with two separate testimonies from tenants who had filed internal complaints, as introduced in earlier stages of the investigation. The court allowed their statements under character pattern relevance. Mid-trial, the prosecution introduced the traffic camera image from 3:52 a.m. The blurred silhouette of a car consistent in make and shape with Cronell's vehicle. No plate, no driver ID, but enough to further compress the timeline of his presence near the crime scene. The bullet recovered from Melinda's pillow was also presented. Although the weapon was never recovered, the trajectory, depth, and residue pattern confirmed a close-range shot, directly tied to the fatal wound detailed in the autopsy. Throughout the proceedings, Cronell remained composed. He wore a dark blazer. He took notes. He rarely looked at the screen when photos of the scene were shown. Jurors later described his demeanor as blank. The trial lasted 8 days. On the 9th, the jury deliberated for 5 hours. They returned with unanimous verdicts on all counts. Guilty. The sentencing phase followed. The judge delivered the sentence without pause. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murder charge, 30 years for criminal sexual conduct, and 15 years for first-degree burglary to be served consecutively. Cronell showed no reaction as the sentence was read. The courtroom was still. Melinda's mother nodded slightly but didn't cry. Her father kept his gaze fixed forward. In criminal trials, closure is a legal term. For families, it rarely means peace. What the verdict offered was certainty, and the formal recognition that what happened to Melinda wasn't random. It wasn't opportunistic. It was facilitated by a system that failed to lock the door behind her. In the end, it wasn't the strength of a confession or witness that sealed this case. It was method, repetition, and the forensic map left behind, because even silent crimes leave trails. After the sentencing, the courthouse emptied without protest. There were no cameras waiting outside, no reporters shouting for comment. Just a quiet November sky and the sound of courtroom doors closing behind Melinda Snyder's parents as they stepped out alone. The conviction had been absolute. The evidence was undeniable. But justice, as defined by law, doesn't repair what has already been broken. The Snyders didn't make statements to the press. They declined interviews. Their only public remark came through a brief written note submitted to the court. "We are grateful for truth, but it does not bring her home." Behind closed doors, change began to take shape. Local property managers initiated a review of their lockbox protocols. Within 6 weeks of the verdict, 3 major firms in York County amended their post-lease procedures. Lockboxes were now required to be removed within 48 hours of contract signing. Failure to comply would result in internal discipline and liability. It wasn't law, but it was a start. At Winthrop University, a small scholarship was created in Melinda's name. It wasn't announced widely. The university's education department simply listed it under memorial contributions, quiet, purposeful, like her. The York County Sheriff's Office later incorporated aspects of the Snyder case into their training module on forensic evidence continuity, specifically emphasizing how layered physical evidence must be treated as a dynamic timeline, not static fact. In private conversations among detectives, one phrase from the case stuck: "He didn't break in, he just opened the door." It was repeated often, not just about this case but as a cautionary note in others, because it was never about the door itself. It was about access handed over, assumed safe, and left unchecked. The murder of Melinda Snyder didn't change state law. It didn't spark national headlines, but it quietly altered the way small communities understood risk, not as something loud and obvious, but as something that sometimes comes dressed in politeness, paperwork, and a realtor's badge. In the end, it wasn't malice that made the crime possible. It was procedure, the kind no one double-checks until it's too late. There's a reason investigators remember this case. It's not just for the forensic clarity, it's for what it revealed. That trust without verification isn't safety. It's a system waiting to be exploited. Melinda's story isn't just a timeline of tragedy. It's a reminder of how prevention doesn't always demand force. It demands attention. What happened to Melinda Snyder wasn't just the result of one man's choices. It was the failure of a system too comfortable with assumptions. As someone who spent years studying cases like this, I've learned one truth. Safety doesn't come from locked doors. It comes from asking the questions no one else wants to ask. Who has access? Who's accountable? And what are we leaving unchecked? If this story moved you, I want to hear from you. What does security mean to you today? Have you ever overlooked something that seemed harmless, only to realize later how critical it was? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. If this video resonated with you or challenged your thinking, don't forget to like and share it. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story that needs to be told.